Another co-founder slash founder wisdom pod, AI edition with Jorge Soto today. He is co-founder at assetmule.ai. He is a podcaster, startups unedited. It's quite funny. GTM Pack Show. Um, Former Twitter and early mopub. He's been through a lot. Last time him and I had an open heart convo, and there's gonna be lots of wisdom to be dropped today. It's gonna really be unedited. It's going to be all out. And we're going to talk about going through this journey of life, especially as a founder, when you take a lot of risk. Lots of knowledge is going to be dropped today. So open your ears up. It's going to be a fun one. Jorge, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your companies?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for, inviting me on the show. It was interesting because I had such a great time talking to you in our prep conversation that I felt this connection. It was an international, or I should say an intellectual connection, international as well. But also it just felt like felt like understood. When there's some people you connect with right away, and then some people that maybe for whatever reason you're not the frequency is not connecting, and I felt like we connected, so very much appreciate it. Yeah, in terms of like companies, boy, like you said, I've been doing startups. The first startup that I was part of was about 22 years ago, when I was still an undergraduate school in college, and it was in the Wi-Fi, wireless internet network space, and we were trying to offer commercial Wi-Fi networks to like colleges and universities, and I kind of got bit by the bug at that time. And if I think about it, there's a whole, like, nowadays I think a lot about like my reasons why I do things in life, and no motivation and inspiration, what catapulted me into stuff. But it was really interesting just to think about how excited I got back then about like being my own boss. And now, 22 years later, I've launched, this is going to be like that I can remember, my 15th startup. Now, one thing to keep in mind, you're like 15, how old are you, 100? It's like, how could you do that? It's like, no, I actually, like, I'm 41, I'll be 42 in September. But I've launched so many, and they most of them don't work out pretty quickly, right? Some of them drag out longer, some, and but most of them, what I found, is generally like founder misalignment, or founders, you get a business partner that's just not willing to really get real when it's when the shit hits the fan and the uncertainty and all that, right? So I've done, that's sort of just saying that I've done a lot of launching of an LLC or a C corp or whatever very quickly, and then a couple months later it doesn't work out for a variety of reasons, but mostly because of partners, the human piece. And then I just kept going for all these years. So I've done B2B SaaS startups. My first like web internet startup was a social network for travel back in 2004. We were trying to clone, basically copy Facebook's simplicity. And actually our first, if you look at the user experience, our first user experience looked just like the first Facebook, or one of the early Facebook's interfaces. Of course, MySpace was out there back then. And so that was back, yeah, 04. And then I've just done a variety of B2B SaaS startups. Have been an early employee at a bunch of early startups too. One that you referenced, mopub, which is always near dear to my heart. It's been so many years since we launched that thing, 12 years now. But it was such an impactful experience for a variety of reasons that I keep it on my LinkedIn. I talk about it all the time. I feel it in my heart, just because of not only the success that we had selling that business to Twitter, or early-ish Twitter days, but also just the relationships and memories. And now I'm doing Asset Mule, and excited about that. But it's a journey. It's always a journey, right?
It's a long one and an interesting one. You learn quite a lot. The other day, you were telling me that, yeah, some of your friends have exited for hundreds of thousands of figures. You know some billionaires also, and sometimes these folks, they are still not happy where their life is. The other day I wrote one of my truism, which is that money will not heal your demons. It will mostly feed them. Do you agree with that dictum right there?
I think that's a good question. I think that they could absolutely, right? Like this notion that money is evil or or some negative thing, I think is based on some truths, right? Like, what is truth, right? That's a much bigger philosophical conversation. But I think that it depends on where you're at in your life and how much healing you've had in your being, and where your head is at. That's another way of saying that. So I think that if you're like someone who's got some, let's just say, I'm just going to throw this out there, like some issues with your inner child, or insecurities and these sort of things. Boy, you take someone who's severely wounded in that way, you give them a couple $100 million, they can really go crazy, right? And really lose themselves in that process, and in all the things that money can bring, right? So I think from that perspective, yes, it could feed that, absolutely, 100%, right? But from another perspective is that if you are someone who's in a good place in their life, and in a place where I would consider a good place, being in a place of loving others, someone that is in a place of a high level of consciousness or awareness of the self, and how it interrelates or corresponds to others around you, family, friends, community, world. I think that if you understand that and you have a high level of emotional and spiritual intelligence, then money can really enable a lot of different things that have a very positive impact on yourself and on the world. So I think it's relative, but my quick answer is yes, it will absolutely fuel the wrong things in a person who's not in a good place.
How was it to be in the early 2000s in the Silicon Valley? Who did you meet, and what lessons did you learn, either from the entrepreneurs that were there at this time, and or just the startup ecosystem environments that you've grown in?
Yeah, so what was interesting, so I got into whole tech startup thing back in 2001, and I was in Florida, in a small town in the capital of Florida, Tallahassee. And I got in not through the Silicon Valley thing. I didn't even really know it existed because I was all the way out over here. And I think it was really when I started to get deep into what we called Web 2.0, which was the whole realm of, now humans are getting online in these online communities, building these social profiles, and that was really brought to another level by MySpace. From my experience, I remember there was Friendster and a variety of other networks before that, but MySpace really kind of like put it on the map, where it was like, holy crap, like this is the thing. And I think really that was when the whole Web 2.0 movement really started. And when I then started my social network for travel that I mentioned to you, and went out to the Bay Area, it was still something that, like, I think the Bay Area was still this unique environment that didn't exist, that had these thoughts and this energy and this creativity and this innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that didn't exist outside of it, from what I could tell. Like nobody in certainly that I knew even knew what a startup was, right? I was the only one, and it was because I met this venture capitalist serendipitously, due to the grace of God or the universe, on campus at my university, and introduced me to that world of Wi-Fi. It wasn't even the internet world. It was just like hardware infrastructure stuff that was generally pretty boring. And I suppose still is, but it was not until I got into that social network for travel concept that then I went over to the Bay Area for the first time, Silicon Valley. And, it was still like, it was still a little different. Again, I wasn't living there at that time. It was still a little different. Some of the people that I met were early, like early Rails developers. When Ruby on Rails was coming up and it was the beginning of this agile framework. I remember I'm not an engineer, so my co-founder and I, he was an engineer, but he was an electrical engineer and wasn't coding. We raised a little money from family and friends, and then we went out to build our product. And what we realized very quickly was that it was still pretty new. And you're probably familiar with the Ruby on Rails project. It was the folks out of I believe Chicago area, where the 37 Signals guys who created that framework. And again, this is the beginning of the agile development framework. That whole model, like just churning out software at a rate that was just never existed before. And so, meeting those folks, getting quotes on building our software early on in those days. And again, it just wasn't like this sexy thing that everybody knew. My family and friends had no idea what I was doing. They just knew I was out there in Silicon Valley trying to kind of do something. And so it was it felt like a different world. I remember also being in San Francisco, and San Francisco was still pre the hype that it had been the last couple of years. I know that post this COVID shenanigans, it's been a little different. But it was just a different world, I would say. One turning point. So the question is, well, when did it really change, I feel? And I got to just say this because I think that when Facebook came up and Mark Zuckerberg and that whole brand, and I know we had Steve Jobs and other kind of luminaries in the past, but it was just a different world, right? The internet did not exist. So that scale did not exist. That knowledge transfer, that connection, interconnectivity didn't exist. And so I think when the Facebook movie came out, that was when I saw like everyone wanted to be an entrepreneur now in the internet game, right? They saw this 19-year-old kid that had this story that I think a lot of us can relate to, of rebellion, of wanting to carve out their own path. And I think that's when sort of like the Silicon Valley culture now started to really permeate the world. And you see it today. I think there's millions of startups created every year, right?
So impressive. The fact that you've been there, in the valley, started a bunch of startups. You're advising at a bunch of places nowadays. How's been the mentoring and the advising for you? Who do you advise, and what's the dealio, and what is the common problems that you see and that you often fix in founders?
Well, I'm just going to be an honest dude, right? Because that's who I am. So I'll be, I'll be honest to answer that question, and you'll see why I'm saying that, or premising my statement with that. It's because, for a long time, I'm 41, and I remember probably 10 years ago, I was so confident in understanding what I felt was the way to launch an entrepreneurial endeavor. I had done a lot of really interesting things. I remember, when I was in graduate school, in the summertime, I used to go door to door selling like, goods, educational books. And I remember there was some kind of like magic that would happen where I literally would just be dropped into a community in somewhere in rural America and be able to sell these things with no marketing, nothing. And that had developed the confidence in me and in this ability to just think that, as long as I knocked on doors, like in reality and even in sort of esoterically or theoretically, that I would be successful. And I think now at 20 something years later, when I've advised many companies, a lot of that was like also me learning from them as well, right? Sharing, because when I got into all these advisory roles at like a lot of incubators and stuff, most people were technical founders. They weren't business folks who who then are sales individuals or sales minded or marketing minded individuals. They were generally technical engineers in Silicon Valley. So it was really easy, I think, for me to like share concepts that were like sales related or business process related, and them really kind of it moved the needle. Fast forward now a decade, like there's that information is now even outdated, right? Like the stuff that I used to say, like the way I used to do email prospecting and things like that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, etc. Totally different these days, right? And there's a variety of reasons why. Tech that's built around it, and then just like sheer volume of that information or those processes. So those best practices now are no longer best practices. So I don't know, man. Like, I don't know how to answer that. That's why I premised it, because like I feel that I'm more, in many ways, more, I hate to use the word lost, because it's not lost, but it's more open to not knowing or not feeling so confident about like, here's the answer. Like, again, many years ago, you would have asked me a question like, how do I prospect, or how do I do something? How do I start to like, go to market in this way? I would say without a doubt, it's these XYZ steps, and you do that, you're going to be successful. No, hands down, no doubt about it. And these days, I think it's a lot different. So I feel a lot different. So my advice to founders is more about the psychological stuff. It's more about like the soft skills, almost like for themselves, right? The spiritual stuff. How do you actually prepare yourself to be to go through the journey and it be sustainable, right? Because it's not going to happen. Look, it could happen. You could have a startup and in 6 months it goes from zero to like some massive acquisition and you're super successful, and that's fine. That may be a possibility. The numbers generally don't add up to that. And so the idea, really the reality is, and of course I may be biased just based on my own experience, is that it's a much longer process. So how do you set up yourself for success and for sustainability? That's what I talk to founders more about, and that I talk to myself more about. So it's really a weird thing, because you would think someone that over time has more experience in a specific space or in just business in general would grow in knowledge and confidence around what they know. And I think that the reality is that life is not like this. Life is actually like this. And so that's the way that I would explain or answer your question.
Yeah, first principles, kind of, I would say the laws of physics. And I thought about ebbs and flows when you were mentioning, like not giving direct advice, because yeah, life is pretty much a cycle of ebbs and flows, So I've been having this phase at which I was bit more humble, although like I could argue that I was never really humble. And then the phase at which I give direct advice, and then it ebbs and flows, because yeah, it's constantly a correction. It's like, oh, I'm too humble now, I'm too vague in my advice now, I need to be more precise. And then it comes back over and over again. So it's karma, it's like black and white mixing up together. So I guess like, and that's a principle in itself, right? Another synonym is seasons. Another synonym is the sun after the rain. I think if founders anchor themselves in the laws of physics and they can understand it better, the shock will be lesser, because yeah, it's quite the stress to start a startup, and each of our systems have a limited amount of stress and RAM kind of that we can handle. And I'm making parallels to computer science. I'm not sure if computer science is a thing, or if it's just the laws of physics itself that it kind of mimics, that us humans, we put it there. But yeah, it's a tough question to answer. It's also because like startups, they all are different, and founders are all different. They all require different advice. They're all living different realities, which makes it super complex to answer that question. You've also had your podcasts. Why did you decided to start your pods? What have you got from them? And what is the next steps for your podcast, I guess?
Yeah. Well, Startups Unedited was started in 2015. But I had done like just YouTube videos and things like that for an organization that I had started back when I was in the Bay Area called salesforstartups.org. And this was probably like, 2010, 2011. Really started to do it more in 2011. And it stemmed really blatantly, it stemmed from my desire to like be known and build a brand for myself and get myself out there as a thought leader in sales for startups in the non-technical, what we would consider now go to market kind of information. And so I started doing that with the sales for startup stuff, as I mentioned, and then it wasn't really a formalized podcast. But then 2015, a couple of years later, I I left Twitter and I was like, I'm gonna go and have fun. And dude, the reality is that like I laugh at it now because I literally was like, I'm just gonna start to do this. I called it Soto Ventures, actually the first ones, because my friends used to call me Soto Ventures, and I used to think about it as like my adventures. My last name was Soto, Soto's Adventures. And over the years, people thought it was like a venture fund, all kinds of stuff that I heard. But that's what the corporate entity was Soto Ventures, and we would we produce this the Startups Unedited podcast. And yeah, it was building relationships, getting me out there, but also having fun. I can't tell you how many times I was like on that podcast, like smoking a joint of weed before, and this is before it became super. Now it's like not a big deal, right? Now you can drink. It's basically in the U.S. like drinking a beer, but I would just be like stoned or having had a drink and go on and talk to these founders and have fun. So it was like this social thing for me too. It was really a creative endeavor. It felt like I was painting a picture or painting or portrait or whatever. And over the years, what I found is that I think people felt that, because I at one point I remember people would come up to me and they knew the show, and I was like, how the hell does anyone know about this? I have no idea how that's happening. But I think people felt that energy. They felt the sincerity of it. And I was truly a nerd geek about this topic, right? I just like lived and breathed this thing. And I invested my own money in editing the videos. I'd hired an editor and etc. And at one point we were even trying to really take it to the next level and build out the Startups Unedited documentary series. And we would travel around the Bay Area and had more professional cameras and audio and things like that. And so we were having a lot of fun with it. Some of the benefits was like just building a ton of relationships. And again, I think people authentically felt when we showed up that we were fans of the game, that we were geeking out, nerding out on this stuff. And then I think that did a whole lot of good. I think that when you execute something from that creative energy, people feel that, and the universe knows that, and it rewards you. So it's built a lot of relationships over the years. And nowadays it's become a thing, because at that time in B2B, it was very, very little. There was a guy named Andrew Warner, I think. I forgot, Mixology or
Mixergy.
Mixergy, that's what it was, who had something, and he was the only one. And then Jason Calcanis, I know, was doing some stuff too with his stuff early on. But other than that, there was like, nobody's doing it, and certainly no one in SaaS. I would like to say that, I was one of the first in SaaS and B2B SaaS to bring this YouTube type of thing to the ecosystem. Now, whether anyone agrees with that is whatever, doesn't matter. But at least I find some joy in that.
You've got lots of prominent guests that you've talked to. What have you learned from them?
The thing that comes right away is this very esoteric thing again, which is that startups are hard, but life can be hard too, right? And so I think it's a mirror. Startups can be this mirror of life. How do you work through challenges? How do you force yourself to find balance? How do you work through conflict and not give up? I think, as I mentioned, I probably gave up too early on a variety of ventures over the years, and there are a variety of reasons why that might be the case. Why we ended up, giving up. Or I mentioned, other stuff too, where teammates are, once shit gets real, as I mentioned earlier, they get scared and want something secure. But what I find is that, in my mind, and this is something that was very clear to me from very little, and I remember sitting there as a 22-year-old kid, my first job at a startup out of college. While, by the way, I was still doing stuff on the side, trying to get my stuff, my own thing off the ground. It was just this inherent knowledge or insight or wisdom or whatnot that I had inside, which was that nothing in life is guaranteed. Even a job at some company somewhere, even a salaried, kind of thing at a larger corporation was not guaranteed. So why not, swing for the fences, and have a full expression of your creative energy, which I think startups can bring. So, one of the biggest things, again, is that I've learned after talking to so many different people, from VCs to, to multiple founders, even till this day, is that, it's a tough journey, and you have to figure out ways to balance it, and it prepares you in many ways for life's ups and downs.
Interesting. Last but not least, you're into yoga meditation. You even started a yoga mat company, which is interesting. How has that helped you be the founder that you are today?
Yeah, so the Ruach yoga bags, it's actually my mom's company, and she's an incredible artist. I do love yoga. I'm technically a yoga teacher, certified yoga teacher, that I got a couple years ago. Yoga has been, it's been such a journey, because you're like, what do you mean, George? Come on, what are you talking about? Like, you're just stretching and stuff. No, that's how people enter yoga. And I think that the mainstream people that don't get what yoga really is, will think it's just an exercise, which, yes, the physical asanas are absolutely part of yoga, but yoga is this approach to life. And I would say that yoga has helped me tremendously over the years, with a variety of different things. But I think one of the biggest things is just introducing me to forms of thought and philosophy, of mindfulness, of these concepts around stillness. It has developed one of the things which I think is, I don't want to say good or bad, but is interesting. I'll just say that yoga has helped me develop such a keen sensitivity for what's happening in my body and mind, this level of awareness, because of the way that you practice, that, sometimes it could be intense, even just sitting down and looking at what's going on, the level of sensitivity in your body that's at the energetic level, where you can feel energy flowing through you, and in some cases, sometimes that can be a really great tool to be able to give you awareness, and other times it could be a bit jarring, because you're so sensitive to the world, that externally, but also the world internally, right? And so, yoga is a journey. Yoga is something that's, again, not just physical. It's energetic. It transcends every aspect of your body. There are multiple aspects to yoga. There's philosophy, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, giving to others, love, unconditional, the practice of unconditional love. Think about that. Do you know that the practice of unconditional love is an aspect of yoga? And you're like, what are you talking about? The practice of unconditional love. We've heard that so many times in religions. Like, I was born and raised in the Christian or Catholic religion. And you know, and it was actually only until I started to embrace like other forms of philosophy or religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff, Eastern philosophies, that I actually understood a lot more about, you know, some of the stuff that I was brought up around, and this concept of unconditional love, loving yourself and loving others without condition. Boy, is that freaking hard, my man. Is that hard? I mean, think about that, right? The judgment, these things, and if we could achieve unconditional love, what would that look like? What would our worlds look like? What would we look like for ourselves? The way we treated ourselves, the way we treated, you know, our spouses and our family, like the people closest to us. So, you know, that was all yoga. You know, that was all stuff that's taught in yoga. That transcends religions. Yoga transcends religions. It transcends philosophies. So yeah, yoga is definitely still a big part of my life. I was doing yoga yesterday at a studio, and my back was super tight, and I was like, oh boy. But yeah, I love yoga.
Thank you so much for the value shared today, George. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, you can go to LinkedIn, Startup George. It used to be Soto Ventures, but I decided to change it a couple, it was a year or two ago. So now it's like Startup George, hashtag Startup George, or in Spanish is Jorge, Startup Jorge, Jorge. You know, on Twitter, but Twitter, LinkedIn, you know, are really the channels that I'm most active on. I have an Instagram, but it's more like it's locked down. It's more like my personal life.